Imagine waking up and seeing your mountain friends burying you alive. You can't move, you can't speak, and your body feels like it's been through a meat grinder. All you can do is watch through a blur of blood as the two men you trusted pick up your rifle, your knife, and your equipment and walk away into the woods. That is exactly where he found himself in late August 1823. He wasn't just dying, he was being deleted from the world. This isn't just a story about a bear attack. It's a story about the ultimate betrayal. But to understand how he ended up in that shallow grave, and why this hurts more than a bear's claws, you have to understand who these men were, and why they were standing in the middle of a literal hellscape in August 1823. We have to go back to the moment his life changed forever in the thick brush of the Grand River. The man in the dirt was Hugh Glass. Now, historical records like the Missouri Intelligencer from back in the day don't give us a birth certificate, but they describe a man who was already a legend before he ever saw a grizzly. Glass was the old man of the group, likely in his late 40s or early 50s. While the other guys were young and green, Glass had already been a sailor, a captive of pirates, and had lived among the Pawnee tribe. He wasn't out there for a vacation or a weekend hunting trip. He was part of the Ashley Henry expedition, a group of about 100 men who ascend the River Missouri as part of a fur trading venture. They were headed toward the Rocky Mountains to find brown gold, beaver pelts. In the 1820s, beaver hats were the height of fashion in London and New York, and a successful trip could make a man rich for life. These men weren't just co-workers, they were mountain men. It was a brotherhood forged in the most brutal conditions imaginable. You had to trust the man next to you with your life. If you got sick, they carried you. If you got hurt, they stayed with you. That was the unwritten law of the frontier. They slept on the bare ground, ate whatever they could kill, and dealt with constant threats from the Iroquois tribe, who, quite reasonably, didn't want 100 armed strangers marching through their backyard. Iroquois tribe are a tribe of Native Americans in North Dakota and South Dakota. Today, they are enrolled with the Mandan and the Hidatsa as the federally recognized tribe known as the Mandan. On this particular morning, the group was pushing through the thick, tangled brush along the Grand River. Hugh Glass was doing his job as the lead scout. He was out front, hunting for meat so the men wouldn't starve. He was moving through a patch of wild plums, the scent of the fruit heavy in the morning heat. But the Missouri River Valley is deceptive. One minute you're in an open meadow, and the next, you're in a thicket so dense you can't see 5 feet in front of you. Glass stepped through a line of bushes and came face to face with the one thing every mountain man feared more than a war party: a grizzly sow with her cubs. Before he could even level his heavy, single-shot long rifle, she hit him like a freight train. A grizzly's bite force is roughly 1,200 psi, enough to crush a bowling ball. She ripped his scalp, crushed his throat, and snapped his leg. When the rest of the crew found him, they didn't see a man. They saw a slaughterhouse. A grizzly isn't just a big bear. It's a 1,000-pound wall of muscle that can run faster than a horse. The first strike was a blur. A grizzly's claws are like 5-inch steak knives, and she used them to zip Glass open from shoulder to hip. He screamed, a sound so loud and jagged it tore through the woods and reached the main camp. But the bear wasn't done. She bit into his neck, her teeth grinding against his vertebrae. He managed to pull his knife and stab at her, a desperate move that probably only made her angrier. She picked him up and slammed him into the earth, snapping his leg bone like a dry twig. By the time the rest of the group, led by Major Henry, came charging through the brush, the scene looked like a slaughterhouse. They fired multiple shots, finally killing the bear, but the man lying underneath her didn't even look human anymore. His scalp was hanging over his eyes, his back was shredded so deep his ribs were visible, and he was coughing up blood. Major Henry, a man who had seen plenty of death, later described it as the most horrific thing he'd ever witnessed. They didn't think he'd last the night. They stitched him up with whatever thread they had and wrapped him in buffalo robes. But here's the thing, Hugh Glass didn't die. He hung on for 2 days, then 3. The expedition was in a crisis. They were in the heart of hostile territory, and carrying a dying man on a stretcher was slowing them down to a crawl. They were sitting ducks for an ambush. Major Henry had to make a cold, hard leadership decision. He offered a massive bonus, $80, which was a fortune back then, to any 2 men who would stay behind until Glass finally breathed his last. He wanted them to give Glass a Christian burial and then catch up. 2 men stepped forward. The first was John Fitzgerald, a guy who was clearly only in it for the money and didn't have a sentimental bone in his body. The second was a 19-year-old kid named Jim Bridger. At the time, Bridger was just a boy looking up to the veterans, and he probably didn't realize what he was signing up for. For 5 days, these 3 were alone in the wilderness. Fitzgerald and Bridger sat there in the silence, watching Glass struggle for every breath. Every rustle in the grass sounded like an Urkara scout. Every howl of a wolf sounded like a death sentence. Fitzgerald started whispering in the kid's ear. He told him that Glass was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. He told him that if they stayed, they were going to die too. He played on the boy's fear until Bridger broke. But Fitzgerald didn't just want to leave. He wanted to get paid. And to get paid, he had to prove to Major Henry that Glass was dead. He didn't want to wait for the heart to stop, so he decided to speed up the process. He didn't kill him with a knife. That would be too honest. Instead, he stripped Glass of everything. He took the rifle, the knife, the canteen, and the fire kit. He took the tools of survival, leaving Glass with absolutely nothing. According to the stories Bridger told later in his life, they dragged Glass's broken, bleeding body into a shallow depression and kicked some dirt and leaves over him. They left him there, buried alive in a hole, while they ran off to collect their blood money. They told the rest of the group that Glass had passed away and they had buried him properly. They even had his rifle to prove it. Everyone mourned the old man Glass, thinking he was gone forever. But as the sun set over the Grand River, a hand, shaking, bloody, and caked in dirt, pushed through the leaves of that shallow grave. Hugh Glass was awake. He was alone. He was unarmed. He was 200 miles from help. And he was absolutely, terrifyingly angry. When Hugh Glass pushed his way out of that shallow grave, he wasn't exactly a man anymore. He was a collection of broken bones held together by raw spite. His leg was snapped, his ribs were crushed, and the wounds on his back were already starting to fester and rot in the humid river air. According to historical accounts from other trappers who later heard his story, like those recorded in the saga of Hugh Glass, he realized immediately that he was in a race against his own body. If the infection didn't kill him, the wolves would. If the wolves didn't get him, starvation would. And if he somehow survived all that, he was still alone, unarmed white man in a territory where he was being hunted by the Urkara. He looked around the site of his own burial and saw nothing. No gun, no knife, no flint to start fire. Fitzgerald had stripped him of every tool a mountain man needed to exist. The nearest help was Fort Kiowa, a small trading post over 200 miles away. To a healthy man on a horse, that's a long trip. To a man who can't even stand up, it was a death sentence. But Glass had one thing the bear couldn't break, a mind that knew how to survive. He couldn't walk, so he started to crawl. He dragged his body forward using only his arms, pulling himself through the dirt and the tall grass of the plains. He headed south toward the Cheyenne River, knowing that if he could reach the water, he might have a chance to float or at least find a more direct path. To keep his broken leg from dragging and catching on every rock, he tied it to a branch using strips of his own shredded shirt. The pain must have been unimaginable. Every inch was a battle. But the real horror wasn't just the physical movement. It was the biological decay. The gashes on his back were deep and wide, and because he was crawling on the ground, they were constantly filled with dirt. Maggots began to hatch in his wounds. Now, to most people, that sounds like a nightmare. But to a frontiersman, It was a miracle. Blowfly larvae are specialists. They only eat necrotic, or dead, flesh. By letting the maggots live in his wounds, Glass was actually preventing gangrene from spreading to his spine. They were cleaning his wounds better than any 1823 doctor could. So, he let them stay. Feeding himself was another puzzle. Without a rifle or a knife, he couldn't hunt. He became a scavenger. He spent his days digging for wild onions and roots. He ate the sour plums that had caused his encounter with the bear in the first place. At one point, he got lucky. He stumbled upon a group of wolves that had just taken down a young bison calf. Glass didn't have a weapon, but he had the desperation of a ghost. He waited, hiding in the grass, and when the wolves were distracted, he managed to scare them off, likely by making enough noise and looking enough like a monster that even the predators were confused. He ate the meat raw, tearing it from the bone with his teeth. It was the first protein he'd had in weeks, and it gave him the strength to keep dragging himself toward the river. As he crawled, his mind stayed focused on two faces, Fitzgerald and Bridger. In the silence of the prairie, he replayed the moment they walked away over and over again. Every time his strength failed, he thought about his stolen rifle. In the world of the mountain man, your rifle was your life. Taking it wasn't just theft, it was a slow-motion murder. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about a settling of accounts. After 6 weeks of crawling, his skin had turned leathery from the sun, and his clothes were nothing but rags. He finally reached the banks of the Cheyenne River. There, according to some of the early 19th century frontier lore, he encountered a group of friendly Lakota Indians. Seeing a man in his condition, literally a walking corpse, they treated him with a mix of pity and awe. They helped clean his wounds, gave him food, and helped him construct a crude raft made of buffalo hides and driftwood. Floating down the river was faster, but it wasn't safer. He was still deep in territory where every bend in the river could hide an ambush. But the old man was fueled by something stronger than fear. He was no longer just a trapper. He was a force of nature. By the time the walls of Fort Kiowa appeared on the horizon in October, Hugh Glass had traveled over 200 miles through one of the most hostile environments on Earth, with no tools and a body that should have been dead months ago. When he finally limped through the gates of the fort, the men there didn't recognize him. They saw a skeletal figure covered in scars, wrapped in rotting skins, with eyes that looked like they had seen the bottom of a grave. When he finally spoke and told them his name, the silence that hit the room was deafening. Hugh Glass had come back from the dead, and he only had one question: where is John Fitzgerald? In their world, when a man was left for dead in the middle of a grizzly's territory without a gun, he stayed dead. But here was Glass, skeletal, scarred, and looking like he'd been dragged through the gears of a mountain. He had just finished a 200-mile journey that should have been impossible. But if you think he stopped there to rest and enjoy a warm bed, you don't know Hugh Glass. The first thing he did wasn't asking for a doctor. It was asking for his gear. He learned that the group he had been part of, the Ashley Henry expedition, had moved on. They were hundreds of miles away at a new camp near the mouth of the Yellowstone River. More importantly, he learned that John Fitzgerald and Jim Bridger were with them. They were telling everyone who would listen about the brave funeral they gave poor old Hugh Glass. They were likely sitting around a campfire at that very moment, using his rifle and his knife, telling stories about a man they buried alive. Glass didn't stay at Fort Kiowa for long. Despite his wounds still being fresh and his body being severely underweight, he joined a small party of traders heading back up the Missouri River. He was heading straight back into the heart of the danger he had just escaped. This part of his journey is documented in the letters of James Clyment, another famous mountain man of the era, who noted that the dead man was back on the trail. The journey upriver was a nightmare in itself. The group was attacked by the Urquhart tribe, the same group Fitzgerald had been so afraid of. Most of the men Glass was traveling with were killed in the ambush. Glass only survived because he was a master of the terrain. He slipped into the woods, and navigated the wilderness alone, once again, using the survival skills he'd honed over a lifetime. He wasn't crawling this time, but he was still a man alone against the world. As he moved toward the Yellowstone River, the winter of 1823 began to set in. The temperature dropped, the rivers began to ice over, and the wind on the plains turned into a razor. For anyone else, this would have been the breaking point. But Glass had a psychological engine driving him that didn't care about the cold. He was fueled by a very specific kind of fire. The need to see the look on John Fitzgerald's face when he realized that the grave couldn't hold the man he robbed. Word started to travel through the frontier like a wildfire. Trappers moving between camps started whispering about a ghost or a zombie that was moving through the woods. They called him the Old Man of the Missouri. When Glass finally reached a place called Fort Tilton, he was told that Major Henry's party had moved again, this time to a more permanent winter camp at the mouth of the Bighorn River. Glass didn't hesitate. He set out across the frozen landscape, traveling through the dead of winter in South Dakota and Montana. This was a trek of hundreds of miles in sub-zero temperatures. He survived by hunting small game and finding shelter in caves or under fallen trees. By the time he finally saw the smoke from the campfires of the Ashley Henry group, he had been traveling for months. On a freezing night in early 1824, the men of the expedition were huddled around their fires. They were safe, they were fed, and they were confident. Jim Bridger, only 19 and likely carrying a heavy weight of guilt, was there. John Fitzgerald was there, probably clutching the very rifle he had stolen from a dead man's side. The gate opened, and a figure stepped out of the darkness. He was draped in ragged furs. His face was a map of scars, and his eyes were glowing with a terrifying intensity. The camp went silent. Some men dropped their plates. Others scrambled back, thinking they were seeing a literal demon. Hugh Glass walked straight into the center of the camp and locked eyes with the men who had left him in the dirt. The ghost had arrived, and it was time for the truth to come out. When Hugh Glass stepped into the light of that campfire, the air sucked right out of the room. This wasn't a movie moment with a big orchestral swell. It was a cold, terrifying silence. Jim Bridger, the 19-year-old kid, looked like he'd seen a literal demon. He was paralyzed. He had spent months trying to convince himself that they had done the merciful thing by leaving Glass. But seeing the man standing there, scarred, skeletal, but very much alive, shattered that lie instantly. Glass didn't go for his gun immediately. He didn't start a brawl. He did something much more calculated. He sat down. He looked at Bridger and he looked at the rest of the crew, and he told the story. He told them about the dirt in his mouth. He told them about the maggots in his back. He told them about the 200 miles of mud and blood he had to crawl through just to stand in front of them again. Major Henry, the leader of the group, was stunned. He had authorized a bonus pay for Glass's burial. Now he realized he had been lied to by his own men. According to the records from the saga of Hugh Glass and the oral traditions of the mountain men, the confrontation with Jim Bridger was the first test of Glass's mission. Bridger was terrified, expecting to be killed on the spot. But Glass looked at the kid, who was shaking and crying, and he saw something else. He saw a boy who had been manipulated by a much older, much more dangerous man. Glass reportedly told Bridger to get up. He told him that he was young, he was stupid, and he had been led astray by a coward. In a move that surprised everyone, Glass forgave him. He told Bridger to learn from this and to never, ever leave a man behind again. It was a moment of grace that turned Jim Bridger into one of the most famous and honorable mountain men in American history. Bridger went on to discover the Great Salt Lake and become a legend in his own right, largely because of the mercy Glass showed him that night. But Glass wasn't finished. He still had one name left on his list: John Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald wasn't at the camp. He had realized early on that if Glass ever did survive, he'd be the first person the old man would come for. Fitzgerald had taken his stolen loot and joined the U.S. Army. He was now stationed at Fort Atkinson in present-day Nebraska. This was a clever move. By joining the army, Fitzgerald was no longer just a trapper. He was a soldier of the United States. He was under the protection of military law. Glass traveled hundreds of miles again, heading down to Fort Atkinson. When he finally walked through those gates and found Fitzgerald, he wanted blood. He wanted to kill the man who had stolen his life and buried him like a dog. But there was a massive problem. If Glass killed a soldier on a military base, the army would hang him before sunset. The commanding officer at the fort heard the whole story. He was disgusted by what Fitzgerald had done, but he couldn't let Glass commit murder. Instead, the officer forced Fitzgerald to give back everything he had stolen. He stood there as Fitzgerald was made to hand over the rifle, the very gun that had been taken from Glass's side at the Grand River. The army also paid Glass a small sum of money as compensation for his troubles. It wasn't the violent, bloody ending people expect from a revenge story. Glass didn't get to twist a knife into Fitzgerald's heart, but he got something better. He got his life back, and he got his reputation back. Fitzgerald was exposed as a coward and a thief in front of every soldier and trapper in the territory. He lived the rest of his life in shame, while Hugh Glass became a symbol of the unbreakable human spirit. Hugh Glass went back to work. He went back to the mountains and back to the rivers. He lived for another 10 years, continuing to scout and trap in the most dangerous places on the continent. Ironically, he wasn't killed by a bear. He eventually met his end in 1833 during a skirmish with the Iroquois on the frozen Yellowstone River, the same tribe Fitzgerald had been so afraid of. The story of Hugh Glass survived because it's not just about a guy who got lucky. It's about the fact that the human will to survive is more powerful than any injury, any environment, and any betrayal. He proved that even when you're stripped of your tools, your friends, and your health, as long as you have a reason to keep moving, even if that reason is just pure, unadulterated anger, you aren't truly dead until you decide to be. Hugh Glass survived the bear, but he wasn't the only one. Next week, we're looking at the man who survived a desert with no water and a tribe on his heels for 300 miles. Subscribe so you don't miss the next survival story. And if you were Hugh Glass, and you finally found the man who took your rifle and left you to die in a grave, would you have pulled the trigger, or would you have walked away like he did? Let me know in the comments.